Before I get into the history of my family, it is important to consider what each and every part of this project represents. Think of the process it takes to learn how to drive. The first step is actually getting a car. Similarly, in order for me to be influenced by my family's history, I actually have to exist. This constitutes the where we come from section of the video. The second step is learning how to drive it, making tough decisions on the fly while still staying patient and calm at the wheel. This step parallels the movers and shakers section of this project, seeing as my family would be reduced to nothing if it weren't for key decisions made in my lineage long ago. Finally, the last step is to actually get out and drive the car with other drivers on the road. Anyone can believe in their family's values, but actually putting them to use in the real world is a much more difficult task, just like driving a car on the open roads. Another point I may add, it is impossible to master. There will always be bumps in the road, but it's just part of life, and being rooted in your family and its values will do nothing but help. In order to answer the question, where do I come from, I will have to dissect the two main branches of this tree, my mother's side and my father's side. Let's begin with my mother's side by seeing where her parents, Barbara Lee Brown and John Rossetti, came from.
January 10th,
What year is it?
2015.
What's your full name?
Barbara Lee Brown Rossetti.
Meet Barbara Lee Brown Rossetti, my mother's mother. She was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma on December 14, 1930. Her grandmother was of Irish descent, and her grandfather was from Missouri. Life was relatively tough for Grammy as a child. She grew up with her brother Howard and her parents Seth and Eunice Brown.
Well, when I was 3 years old, my mother died. And I was afraid of everything then, because I didn't.
After this, she tended to spend more time with her paternal grandparents, who lived on a farm in Tulsa. Along with her mischievous brother, she tended to several animals on the farm, including chickens, helping her grandfather gather eggs to gain income during the Great Depression.
Cows and pigs and horses and barns and fields. And grandfather had a big chicken house, and he packed the eggs and sold them, but that was how he made his retirement money.
In addition to the unfortunate loss of her mother, Grammy and her family also had to deal with the troubled 1930s, specifically the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl.
Well, my daddy worked, and when I was in high school, I had a part-time job.
As well as the Great Depression, Tulsa was also affected by the Dust Bowl. While she was an early teen, Grammy recalls seeing the dust blow over the dry climate and seeing several lightning strikes come close to her house.
When that happened, everybody was out of money. I didn't have much money. So I just did what I had to do, went to school, went home.
Do you remember dust storms or anything like that happening?
I remember big lightnings.
Big lightnings, yeah. Those are pretty dry.
Eventually, Grammy left the farm at age 18 after graduating high school. She then went from there to work for an insurance company until she married my maternal grandfather, Joe Rossetti. She and her husband, Joe, had 4 children, including my mother. Moving on to John Rossetti, Barbara's husband. John Rossetti, or Giovanni Battista Rossetti, was born in Pordenone, Italy, just north of Venice. In 1929, he left his home at age 3 and traveled across the Atlantic on a boat ride that took upwards of 2 weeks.
So, at what age did he immigrate? Was John?
Oh, John was 3 years old.
3 years old.
How did he get here?
On a boat.
He then lived most of his early life in Manhattan, New York, after traveling through Ellis Island. There, he learned to speak English. Growing up, Papa was a member of the Manhattan Boys Club, which provided him and his family with free extracurricular activities, such as going to different camps in the summer and participating in puppet shows, talent shows, or even bowling.
A place called Madison Square Boys Club. Went there every day and learned how to swim, learned how to ski, learned how to do all those sports things.
After becoming a citizen at age 23, Papa went to work for American Airlines as an airplane mechanic. He was a very meticulous craftsman, making sure each part of the aircraft was ready to go before takeoff. He even worked on cars in his spare time. He then met my grandmother, Barbara Lee Brown, and had 4 children. Now moving on to my father's side of the family. My father's parents are Charles Lloyd Gunn and Margaret Grace Shanks. We will start with my father's father, Charles Gunn, whose family is of English and Scottish descent.
Mine's Charles Lloyd Gunn. One part of them came from England. One was a general in the Revolutionary War. On my dad's side, the first gun that came to this country came from Germany, they think, but probably was of Scotch ancestry.
Originally, the territory of the Clan Gunn was in Caithness and Sutherland in Scotland. The clan is noted for its warlike and ferocious character. However, it was defeated in the 16th century by the Earls. Shown here on the left is the Clan Gunn's pattern, and on the right is its crest. Written in Latin on the crest here are the words either peace or war. My grandpa Chuck was born in Edwardsville, Illinois on June 23, 1930. When he was 3 years old, his family moved to a suburb of Chicago, and his parents were both school teachers there. During high school, Chuck met his future wife, Margaret Shanks. After graduating high school, he was about to embark on his second year studying chemistry at the University of Illinois, when he decided he would rather be a chemical engineer. Right about the time he graduated, he was deployed to a U.S. Navy destroyer for 3 years during the Korean War. After serving, he got his master's degree and worked for Procter & Gamble for 38 years. There, he received 13 patents, most for detergent packaging.
I had 13 patents. Most of them were on packaging. One of those was one I did myself, but the 12 were when I was working for Procter & Gamble.
His 2 biggest accomplishments there were creating a no-spill cap for Tide detergent and engineering a new packaging handle that worked more efficiently in P&G's many manufacturing lines, saving the company several millions of dollars. I even got the chance to fly to my grandparents' house in San Diego, California, and talk with them more about their experiences growing up and the mark that they left on my family. And lastly, we move on to my paternal grandmother, Margaret Gun. As far as her ancestors, her mother's side descends from Ireland, immigrating to America because of the Great Potato Famine, and her father's side descends from Scotland. Her parents are both Canadian, one from Sault Ste. Marie and one from Ontario. My grandmother was born in St. Louis, Missouri, but then soon moved to Houston during World War II. This was when she received the news that she had malaria, so they moved north to Chicago for a more suitable climate. After this, her father got a new job in California and moved the whole family there. Looking back on moving around so much as a child, she comments on the pros and cons of being a part of a transient family.
The biggest effect was it was very hard on me to change, these major cities, to go from one city to another, and not only that, but like when we lived in St. Louis, just out of circumstances, I lived in about 4 different houses, and all that change is hard when you're young. But on the other hand, I feel like that I feel more at home whenever I get into a situation where I don't know anyone, that it's easier for me to make friends because I had a lot of practice doing it.
Yeah.
And it's just it's interesting to do in different parts of the country.
She then went on to marry my grandfather, Chuck Gunn, and have 3 children, including my father. This concludes the Where Do We Come From section of my report. Next, we will be taking a look at the movers and shakers in my family. In order to answer the question, who are the movers and shakers in your family? I've interviewed both of my parents, procuring insightful information on the lives of several impactful decision makers in their respective families. We will start with my mother's interview, in which she talks about her grandfather's decision to immigrate to America and her father's decision to be a hard worker throughout his entire life.
Today's date is January 21st, 2015, and my name is Regina Rossetti Gunn, otherwise known as Gina. I'd say the first person that was the biggest decision maker in my family was my grandfather, whose name was Giuseppe Rossetti, and he was born in Italy, and he immigrated to the United States as an adult, and he brought his whole family here, his wife and his 2 children. So I'd say he's the first one. And then the second, I think, would be probably my dad. He was a very hardworking laborer who did not have a college education, and he influenced me and my siblings greatly because of his focus on education. He made a lot of sacrifices so that we could be educated.
What particular decision showed the most leadership from him, and how was that decision risky?
Well, he worked in the terrazzo industry in Italy, which he would lay terrazzo flooring, and was having a hard time supporting his family in Italy. So he took a risk and immigrated to the United States, leaving his family behind for several months while he came to this country to find work. He came through Ellis Island and eventually found work in New York City, laying terrazzo floor in some of the major buildings in New York City, including the Empire State Building. And so once he was established in work, he decided to bring his family here and sent for his wife and 2 children. And so they came over to meet him. He did not go back and get them. My grandmother brought my dad and his sister over on a boat, and they also immigrated to New York. So they took some risks in coming here, leaving all of their family, he had several siblings, behind in Italy. And they never returned to live in Italy. They stayed in the United States and never went back, really, to live.
How did the decision of immigrating to America pay off? And more specifically, how did it affect you and me?
So how did it pay off? Well, I think for my dad and his sister and his parents, they gained family stability in New York City. He made a good living. They were able to find community, because community was very important in their Italian culture. They found community in New York City with other Italian immigrants. They had a pretty rich, not wealthy life, but an interesting life in New York City. Eventually, my dad found great employment in the airline industry, working on airplanes, because he received some training in New York City, and then later he moved to Oklahoma. But so I would say that he gained a stable living for his family, and my dad and his sister received an education in the United States. So that was one plus. How did it affect us? Well, ultimately, because they immigrated to the United States and stayed, my dad obviously grew up, he got a job, and he moved to Oklahoma. So, and started a family in Oklahoma, so that's how I was born. I think because education and family stability was so important to my father, those values were, my grandfather, those values were passed on to my dad, who in turn, shared the same values and worked really hard to educate his 4 kids, including myself. And he had a very strong work ethic like his father. I think those were strong values that were passed down.
After this, I interviewed my father about his parents, Margaret and Chuck Gunn, the primary movers and shakers in his life.
State your name.
Today's date is January 21st, 2015. My name is Doug Gunn.
If you had to pick 2 main decision makers from your older relatives, who would they be?
I'm going to choose my mother and father as example decision makers among my older relatives.
And could you explain why?
They made decisions consciously that they stuck to throughout their life, and those decisions had a big effect on me and ultimately on Gordon as well. The two main decisions they made were one apiece. And they actually made the first one jointly. They made the decision to move to Cincinnati, Ohio, where neither had lived before. They were both raised in Chicago, but my father had just finished his graduate degrees at Oregon State University, and they made the decision to move to Cincinnati, Ohio in 1956. They were actually pregnant with me at the time, and my father joined the corporation Procter & Gamble because he thought it was a long-term career move, a good place to raise the family, and those decisions turned out to be true. My mother made the decision to commit to raising her family, our family, as her career. And she stuck to that decision as well. She returned to work later when my brothers and myself were raised, essentially. But they made a conscious decision to set their life in that direction, to rely on Procter & Gamble, to rely on my dad's career, to rely on that decision, to rely on Cincinnati, Ohio. And they dove in with both feet to do everything they could to execute that plan.
What motivated their decision to raise 3 kids, or what were they thinking behind that decision?
What they shared with me was that the environment of the times, the 1950s, made sense to make a commitment to a public corporation. My dad had not only gotten an undergraduate degree, he had by this time gotten experience in leadership in the Navy, and he had a master's degree in chemical engineering. Once he started working, pursued an MBA, Master's of Business Administration. So they were motivated basically by the belief that the times were right for this plan to work. Secondly, they had each come from family environments by which they had decided that that was the right environment that they wanted to raise their kids in. That's the life they wanted to lead. Lastly, my mother shared with me that she was interested in stability. Her family had moved, not as much as some military families, but they had moved several times during her childhood. And it was her motivation to move less, to be rooted and planted more for the sake of family friendships, and in her mind to avoid the disruption that she did not enjoy when she was a child. My dad had to prove himself in his career. He had to establish himself. He had to compete. But I think their first obstacle really was to be alone in a new city, pregnant, and really without any support system. Back in 1956, 1957, their parents could not easily support them personally by being there for them as they started their family. I think they were relatively lonely at first. So that was an obstacle. They had to survive many different economic cycles. Their health challenges were modest. I wouldn't say that was an extreme obstacle. However, it is true that my mother had several miscarriages in the process of ultimately producing us 3 boys. There was a significant gap in time between the brother that followed me and our 3rd brother. So it took a fair amount of persistence and patience to overcome that obstacle and complete the family that they visualized.
How have these decision makers that you mentioned shown leadership throughout their lives?
Well, referring back to my mother and father as the decision makers, I think the leadership qualities that I observed were being willing to sacrifice, being persistent, being willing to, as you asked already, to face obstacles directly and overcome them. An additional lesson or an aspect of leadership that was called to my attention relatively later in my life was the ability to resolve conflict. Leaders resolve conflict. Leaders keep not only themselves but those they are leading on the path, if not directly in pursuit of the objective, at least avoiding the team getting distracted and keeping the focus on that objective. And resolving conflict is a big part of that.
So how have the movers and shakers you described, basically your mother and father, how have they moved our family forward?
Well, I followed somewhat a similar pattern by choosing to go to Texas, leaving the Midwest. The Chicago-Cincinnati nexus was the well-worn path as I was leaving graduate school. But my parents were willing to support my decision to go to Texas, and their example helped me feel that this was an attainable and reasonable goal. So that's how Gordon became a Texan. Well, I'm going to give you one anecdote on leadership that you can put in where you'd like. And it's an example of bacon and eggs, where they say, yes, the chicken made a contribution, but the pig was committed. And that's an example of the level of sacrifice that you have to make to become a true leader.
I'd say there are three main values it boils down to. The first is a combination of being able to take risks and not being afraid to be uncomfortable. I think this value can be attributed to my early Italian ancestors, who had the willpower to take the risk to come from Italy and immigrate to America, and as you can see, it's obviously paid off. I'd also add that the willingness to be uncomfortable has made me a happier, more versatile person. For instance, I was definitely nervous coming to St. Mark's from a different school. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to survive the academic rigor, the athletics, but through the encouragement of my parents, my siblings, my grandparents even, I was able to make it, and I couldn't be happier with the way things have turned out. I mean, St. Mark's is amazing. So definitely not being afraid to be uncomfortable and, clear those obstacles. So that's the first value, just being able to take risks, being able to be uncomfortable and persevere. But I'd say the second risk that my family emphasizes is caring for others more than you care for yourselves. I come from a line of very intelligent, hardworking men and women who cared more than anything for their children to live successfully and comfortably. And although this is a hard act to follow, I guess, it's definitely shaped the way I've lived my life and how I've cared for others. And while this is much easier said than done, and I'm probably one of those greedy, average teenagers you hear about, I do believe that it's made me a more generous, benevolent person. My grandparents, my uncles, my aunts, my three sisters, my cousins, my mom, my dad, they've all been Christians in some way or fashion, whether it be Catholic, Presbyterian, Episcopalian. I speak for my entire family when I say God is the driving force behind the things we do, the things we say, how we treat others, how we care for others, how we're able to take risks. God urges us and is the motivating factor that helps us and lets us do these things. And He's provided so much for our family that we owe basically everything to Him. My faith has led me to meet hundreds of new people through Bible study, church, young life, being in a band. It's just made my life 1,000 times more meaningful. I'd also add that if my family were to have a telos, I'd say our telos is to have a meaningful relationship with God.